I watched the slow dive bombers circle while my orders pulled me lower, chasing threats we understood. My superiors taught me which aircraft mattered and which could wait. When the decks burned, I understood what waiting had cost us. The sky was the same, but the rules I trusted were gone. In early June 1942, the operational balance in the Pacific rested on a narrow set of assumptions held by both sides. The Imperial Japanese Navy, having advanced across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific in the previous 6 months, prepared for another deliberate operation aimed at extending its defensive perimeter. The objective was Midway Atoll, a small American outpost northwest of Hawaii. Japanese planners viewed the attack as a controlled engagement that would draw out remaining U.S. carrier forces and destroy them under favorable conditions. The Japanese carrier striking force assembled for the operation was built around 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, vessels that had carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent raids across the Indian Ocean. Their air groups were experienced, their fighter pilots confident, and their doctrine tested through repeated success. The American carrier force, by contrast, was reduced to 3 operational carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. U.S. naval aviation crews were unevenly trained, their equipment mixed in quality, and their tactics still evolving. On the morning of 4 June 1942, the Japanese carrier force operated northeast of Midway in accordance with established doctrine. Combat air patrols were launched at regular intervals. Aircraft were cycled below decks, refueled and rearmed in anticipation of follow-on strikes. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft were expected to confirm the absence or late arrival of American carriers. The Japanese command believed time favored them. Among the Japanese airmen assigned to the carriers that morning were fighter pilots tasked with high-altitude patrol and interception. Their routine was structured and familiar. They climbed to altitude, formed patrol patterns, and watched for incoming aircraft. By mid-1942, these pilots had encountered a wide range of Allied aircraft. They had learned to identify silhouettes quickly and to judge threats by speed, formation, and maneuverability. One aircraft in particular had acquired a reputation among Japanese aviators: the American SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Slow in level flight, limited in defensive armament, and unable to evade a determined fighter attack, the Dauntless was not considered a serious challenge to experienced Japanese pilots. Its earlier appearances in combat had reinforced this view. When encountered without fighter escort, it was vulnerable. Even with escort, it lacked the speed to disengage. Japanese pilot training emphasized aggressive interception. Fighters were directed toward incoming bombers, with priority given to torpedo aircraft flying at low altitude. Dive bombers approaching from higher altitudes were considered secondary threats to be engaged once torpedo attacks were broken up. This hierarchy reflected experience. Torpedo attacks, when successful, could cripple a ship at or below the waterline. Dive bombers, though capable of inflicting damage, were often less decisive in Japanese assessments, especially when attacking maneuvering ships protected by anti-aircraft fire. That morning, initial American attacks followed patterns the Japanese had learned to expect. Torpedo squadrons arrived piecemeal, often without adequate fighter cover. Aircraft such as the TBD Devastator flew low and slow, presenting clear targets for Japanese fighters. Interceptions were efficient and devastating. Losses among American torpedo squadrons were severe, and few achieved effective attack positions. From the perspective of Japanese air defense, these engagements confirmed existing assumptions. The combat air patrols performed as trained. Fighters expended ammunition, rotated back to carriers, and were replaced by fresh aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners maintained readiness, though their weapons were seldom needed against aircraft destroyed at a distance. During these early phases, Japanese pilots also observed high-altitude aircraft maneuvering above the main engagement zones. These were identified as American dive bombers, including the Dauntless. Their presence was noted but not prioritized. Without immediate attack dives, they were not considered an urgent threat. Fighters returning low on fuel or ammunition were not redirected upward unless specifically ordered.
One Japanese flight pilot, whose name appears only briefly in post-war records, recorded in his flight log the sighting of slow dive bombers circling above. The note was unremarkable, consistent with many similar observations made during previous engagements. The aircraft were seen as waiting for an opening that would likely never appear. Below decks on the Japanese carriers, routine operations continued. Aircraft were being rearmed following the initial strike on Midway. Ordnance crews worked under time pressure, but within familiar procedures. Fuel hoses lay across hangar decks. Bombs and torpedoes were moved by hand and trolley. The process required coordination and discipline, but it was standard practice during combat operations. The Japanese command structure relied heavily on doctrine refined before the war. Carrier operations emphasized sequential strikes, tight control, and centralized decision-making. Deviations from plan were discouraged unless clearly warranted. Reports from air patrols were filtered through command channels, assessed against expectations, and acted upon accordingly. At this stage of the engagement, the Japanese carrier force continued to operate under the belief that control of the air had been secured and that remaining threats could be addressed in sequence.
By mid-morning on 4 June 1942, the tempo of operations aboard the Japanese carriers increased. Combat air patrol fighters rotated continuously, landing to refuel and rearm before returning to station. Deck crews worked to recover aircraft from earlier engagements while preparing others for potential launch. The strain on coordination was manageable but growing. Each cycle narrowed the margin for error. Reports from airborne reconnaissance began to arrive with greater urgency. One scout aircraft, launched earlier to search sectors beyond Midway, transmitted a contact report indicating the presence of American naval forces. The message was incomplete, initially lacking confirmation of aircraft carriers. It was processed cautiously. Japanese doctrine emphasized confirmation before action. An unverified report did not warrant immediate alteration of strike plans. As additional information filtered in, the situation became less clear rather than more certain. Delays in communication, the limitations of radio transmission, and the fog of ongoing combat complicated interpretation. The possibility that American carriers were closer than anticipated could not be dismissed, but neither could it be confirmed with confidence. Below decks, ordnance crews continued rearming aircraft. The decision to reconfigure the strike force, whether to prepare for a second attack on Midway or to shift to anti-ship ordnance, was debated within the command structure. This was not a simple choice. Japanese carriers were designed to conduct rapid, concentrated strikes, but changing bomb loads required time and exposed vulnerabilities while aircraft were clustered in hangar spaces. Meanwhile, American air attacks continued, though with diminishing effectiveness. Additional torpedo squadrons arrived, again flying low and slow. Japanese fighters intercepted them at distance. Losses were severe. Few American aircraft survived long enough to release weapons, and those that did rarely achieved favorable angles. To Japanese observers, these attacks reinforced a familiar pattern, determined but ineffective assaults that could be absorbed without decisive consequence. Yet these repeated engagements had cumulative effects. Fighters pursued torpedo aircraft down to sea level and far from the carriers. Altitude discipline eroded. Patrol coverage thinned at higher elevations as pilots focused on immediate, visible threats. The sky above the carrier force, though not empty, was less densely guarded than doctrine prescribed. Japanese pilots returning from interceptions reported their ammunition expenditure and fuel states. Turnaround times lengthened slightly. Deck officers adjusted schedules to maintain coverage. These adjustments were routine responses to combat conditions, not signs of alarm.
Above the carriers, American dive bombers remained in holding patterns. Their crews observed the battle unfolding below. From altitude, they could see the white wakes of torpedoes, the splashes of anti-aircraft fire, and the movements of Japanese ships. They noted the absence of coordinated fighter opposition at their level. They waited. Within the Japanese command, confidence persisted. The American torpedo attacks were being defeated at great cost to the attackers. Anti-aircraft gunners had little to do. Fighters were performing as expected. The carriers themselves had not yet been struck. Yet the Dauntless dive bomber, however, was still present. Its continued loitering did not prompt immediate concern. Japanese pilots were accustomed to enemy aircraft circling at the edge of engagement zones, seeking opportunities that rarely materialized. The assumption remained that when these aircraft finally committed to an attack, they would be met and destroyed. Operational doctrine did not prioritize preemptive engagement of high-altitude dive bombers unless they initiated a dive. Fighters low on fuel were not to climb unnecessarily. Maintaining continuous patrol coverage took precedence over chasing distant threats. As time passed, the cumulative wear on Japanese air defenses became more pronounced. Fighters cycled repeatedly through combat, recovery, and relaunch. Pilots experienced fatigue. Coordination between fighter direction officers and airborne units grew more complex as multiple engagements overlapped. At approximately the same time, new intelligence arrived indicating that American carriers were indeed present. The confirmation came later than ideal. The window for an immediate, fully coordinated counterstrike was narrowing. Aircraft below decks were in various stages of rearming, some configured for land attack, others for naval strike. This mixed state reduced flexibility. The decision was made to continue preparations while reassessing target priorities. This choice reflected adherence to established procedures rather than improvisation. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized order and sequence, even under pressure. In the air, the disparity between threat perception and actual vulnerability widened. Torpedo aircraft, though devastating when successful, were being neutralized efficiently. Dive bombers, less immediately dangerous in Japanese estimation, remained unchallenged at altitude. The layered defense system, designed to address multiple threats, was being drawn downward and outward. Japanese pilots who glanced upward occasionally noted the silhouettes of the dive bombers against the sun. These sightings did not trigger alarm. The aircraft was slow, stable, and appeared hesitant. Their lack of immediate action suggested indecision or fear. The reality was more complex. American dive bomber crews were coordinating their approach, aligning attack runs, and waiting for a moment when defenses were least concentrated. Their training emphasized patience as much as aggression. They were aware of their aircraft's limitations and relied on timing rather than speed for survival. The operational environment aboard the Japanese carriers became increasingly congested. Aircraft movements on deck were constrained. Fuel lines and ordnance were exposed. The carrier's defensive posture depended on the assumption that air superiority had been secured. This assumption was not entirely unfounded. Japanese fighters had achieved overwhelming success against torpedo squadrons. Loss ratios were heavily in their favor. From a statistical perspective, the air defense appeared effective. Yet effectiveness against one category of threat did not translate automatically to others. The separation of threats into hierarchical priorities, while logical in theory, created blind spots in practice. High-altitude dive bombers did not fit neatly into the most urgent threat category until they began their dives. As the morning advanced, the Japanese carrier force found itself in a transitional phase, between strikes, between decisions, and between assessments. The situation was dynamic, but the response remained procedural. The Dauntless aircraft, still dismissed as secondary, continued to circle. Their presence was tolerated rather than contested. Japanese pilots trusted that when the moment came, they would respond as they always had. The gap between doctrine and unfolding reality was widening, though it remained largely invisible to those focused on immediate tactical engagements. The conditions that would expose this gap were now in place.
Late in the morning of 4 June 1942, the Japanese carrier force entered a critical phase, defined not by a single decision, but by a convergence of timing, positioning, and routine procedure. The carriers were maneuvering into the wind to recover returning aircraft. Fighter patrols were in flux, with some aircraft low on fuel and others temporarily out of position. The air defense system remained active, but it was stretched. On the flight decks and in the hangars, activity intensified. Aircraft that had landed earlier were being moved aside, others were brought up from below. Ordnance crews worked among rows of aircraft, handling bombs and torpedoes that had been partially reconfigured during earlier decision cycles. The carriers were momentarily at their most crowded state, a condition that was known and accepted as part of normal operations. Command attention remained divided. Reports concerning American carriers had been received, but their exact position and composition were still being clarified. The window for launching a coordinated counterstrike existed, but it required the recovery and rearming of aircraft already committed. Japanese doctrine favored completeness over haste. A fragmented strike was considered inefficient and potentially wasteful. Above this activity, American dive bombers continued to hold altitude. Their crews had been airborne for hours. Fuel consumption was carefully managed. Formation discipline was maintained despite the physical strain. They scanned the sea below, searching for the distinctive shapes and wakes that would confirm the presence of the Japanese carriers. The dive bombers were not acting independently. Though communication between squadrons was limited, their general intent was aligned. Training emphasized attacking when enemy defenses were least prepared, even if that meant extended loitering. This patience contrasted sharply with Japanese expectations of immediate commitment. At approximately this stage, a small number of Japanese fighters did regain altitude, either returning from low-level pursuits or climbing after refueling. These fighters were too few to form a comprehensive barrier. Their focus remained reactive rather than anticipatory. One Japanese pilot later noted in a post-war interview that the sky above the carriers seemed clear enough, a statement reflecting the perspective from lower altitude. The layered nature of airspace meant that what appeared secure from one level could be exposed from another. The American dive bombers began to reposition. Their movement was subtle, not a sudden mass turn. Groups adjusted headings, aligning with the sun to reduce visibility from below. They descended slightly to prepare for attack runs, still beyond the immediate detection priorities of Japanese fighter direction. Below, Japanese ships maintained formation. Anti-aircraft guns were manned but not actively engaged. The carrier's defensive posture assumed that any high-altitude threat would be detected during the dive phase, providing time to respond. This assumption underestimated the speed at which a dive bomber could convert altitude into velocity. It also assumed uninterrupted command and control during the critical seconds of an attack. The turning point of the engagement did not involve a formal order or dramatic signal. It occurred when the American dive bombers, having waded through repeated torpedo attacks and defensive cycles, recognized a moment of reduced opposition. The absence of concentrated fighter coverage at altitude was not total, but it was sufficient. The decision to attack was executed by individual squadron leaders in accordance with standing orders. There was no need for improvisation beyond timing and alignment.
The doctrine guiding the dive bomber crews emphasized precision over volume. Each aircraft selected a target and prepared its dive. From the Japanese perspective, the initial indication of danger was visual rather than procedural. Lookouts and gunners saw aircraft begin steep descents from high altitude. The silhouettes that had lingered harmlessly above now accelerated rapidly, their profiles changing from distant specks to distinct forms. The response was immediate but constrained. Fighters at low altitude could not climb in time. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but tracking fast-diving aircraft proved difficult. The carriers themselves began evasive maneuvers, but their ability to maneuver was limited during aircraft recovery operations. The Dauntless dive bomber, previously dismissed as slow and vulnerable, revealed its operational purpose in this phase. Its design emphasized stability in steep dives and accuracy in bomb release. The aircraft was not intended to survive prolonged fighter engagement. It was designed to deliver ordnance with precision under specific conditions. As bombs were released, gravity and speed replaced vulnerability. The time between detection and impact was measured in seconds. For Japanese airmen who had earlier regarded the Dauntless with skepticism, the shift was abrupt. The aircraft's earlier passivity had masked its effectiveness. The layered defense system, optimized for expected threats, was now reacting to a threat it had deprioritized. The first explosions occurred amid the densely packed decks and hangars. Fuel, ordnance, and aircraft were concentrated in confined spaces. Damage control procedures were initiated immediately, but the scale and location of the damage posed challenges. From the perspective of the dive bomber crews, the attack phase was brief and intense. Training took over. Bomb release points were calculated visually. Pullouts were executed under fire. Losses were incurred, but the focus remained on egress rather than assessment. The Japanese command now faced a situation that diverged sharply from Doctrine. Multiple carriers were damaged in rapid succession. The expectation that air superiority had been secured was no longer tenable. For the pilots who had earlier laughed at the Dauntless, the aircraft's role was now unmistakable. It was not designed to dominate the air or to evade fighters indefinitely. Its value lay in exploiting moments of imbalance, moments that Doctrine had not fully accounted for. The turning point was not merely tactical, it was conceptual. An aircraft dismissed based on its apparent limitations delivered results disproportionate to its perceived threat. As smoke rose from damaged decks and emergency measures continued, the engagement entered a new phase. The consequences of earlier assumptions were now unfolding, not as isolated incidents, but as systemic failures. The battle was no longer proceeding within anticipated parameters.
In the minutes following the dive bomber attacks, the Japanese carrier force confronted a situation that existing procedures were not designed to resolve quickly. Fires spread across flight decks and into hangar spaces. Secondary explosions followed as stored ordnance ignited. Damage control teams responded according to training, sealing compartments, flooding magazines, and attempting to isolate burning areas. Their efforts were disciplined and immediate, but the concentration of fuel and aircraft complicated containment. Carrier command staffs worked to regain situational awareness. Communications between ships were strained. Smoke obscured visual signals. Radio traffic increased, often overlapping. The assumption of operational continuity, central to Japanese carrier doctrine, had been broken. Individual carriers now faced distinct emergencies requiring localized decisions. Fighter pilots returning to their carriers encountered altered decks, damaged landing areas, or orders to divert. Some aircraft were forced to ditch at sea. Others circled, waiting for clearance that never came. The combat air patrol, already thinned by earlier engagements, became fragmented. Within the Japanese command structure, the implications of the damage were quickly recognized. Aircraft losses on deck far exceeded those in the air. The carrier's offensive capability had been sharply reduced in a matter of minutes. This outcome conflicted with pre-war assessments that emphasized the resilience of carrier groups against piecemeal air attack. The response from higher authority emphasized stabilization rather than immediate counteraction. Orders focused on damage control,
aircraft recovery where possible and maintaining formation integrity. The possibility of launching an effective counterstrike diminished rapidly as usable aircraft and intact decks became scarce. For Japanese pilots, the shift was personal. Many had lost aircraft, crewmates, or the ability to land on their assigned carriers. The earlier confidence derived from successful interceptions gave way to uncertainty. The enemy aircraft they had discounted had delivered damage that fighters could not undo after the fact. In post-war analyses, several Japanese officers noted that the issue was not a lack of courage or effort, but the rigidity of threat prioritization. The defense system had performed well against the threats it was optimized to defeat. It had struggled against a threat that exploited timing rather than strength. As emergency operations continued, the remaining operational carrier attempted to absorb the shock and continue the battle. Launches and recoveries resumed on a limited scale. The fight was not over, but the balance had irreversibly shifted. The Dauntless dive bomber did not dominate the skies after the attack. It did not render Japanese fighters obsolete. Its role was specific and bounded, yet its impact exposed a gap between expectation and reality that Doctrine alone could not bridge. By early afternoon, the Japanese carrier force was operating under severe constraint. The system that had delivered success across the Pacific now faced a test it could not fully answer. Decisions made earlier in the day, reasonable within established frameworks, had produced consequences that could not be easily mitigated. The engagement moved toward its final phase, shaped less by individual aircraft performance than by accumulated outcomes and institutional limits.
By the end of June 1942, the Japanese carrier force that had set out to draw the U.S. Navy into a decisive engagement no longer existed as a coherent striking arm. 3 of the 4 fleet carriers were lost during the day, and the 4th was sunk the following morning. The loss was not only material, but institutional. The carriers represented years of construction, training, and doctrinal development. Their air groups contained some of the most experienced naval aviators Japan possessed. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese command assessments focused on damage control failures, intelligence gaps, and operational timing. Reports acknowledged that American dive bombers had achieved results far exceeding expectations. The aircraft itself was not described as technologically superior in all respects, but its employment under the conditions of that day was recognized as effective. The Dauntless did not become a symbol of invincibility in Japanese analyses. Instead, it became an example of how an aircraft's perceived weaknesses could obscure its actual role. Its slow speed and limited maneuverability had led to its dismissal as a secondary threat. Its ability to deliver accurate bombs from altitude, however, had been underestimated within the threat hierarchy. Japanese post-war studies noted that the failure was not simply tactical, it was rooted in doctrine. Air defense priorities had been shaped by earlier engagements where torpedo aircraft posed the greatest danger. That framework had worked repeatedly, reinforcing confidence. At Midway, the framework remained unchanged, even as circumstances diverged from earlier patterns. The response within the Imperial Japanese Navy was restrained rather than public. There was no immediate doctrinal overhaul during the war. Resource constraints, ongoing operations, and the cumulative effects of attrition limited the ability to adapt. Lessons were identified but not fully integrated before the balance of power shifted further against Japan. For the American Navy, the outcome reinforced the value of coordinated dive bomber attacks and patience in execution. The Dauntless continued to serve throughout the war, not as a dominant fighter or a fast attack aircraft, but as a reliable delivery platform when used in accordance with its design strengths. Individual Japanese pilots who survived the battle carried the experience quietly. In later years, some acknowledged that their early assessments of the Dauntless had been shaped more by appearance and prior encounters than by a full understanding of its operational purpose. The aircraft they had laughed at was not dangerous in every context, but it had been decisive in one. The legacy of the Dauntless at Midway is therefore not one of sudden technological surprise, but of misjudged relevance. It succeeded not because it was universally superior, but because it exploited a moment when doctrine, timing, and perception failed to align. The story of Midway is often told through sweeping narratives and strategic outcomes. Within it are smaller lessons about how systems assess threats, how routine success shapes expectations, and how overlooked capabilities can matter when conditions change. If you value historically grounded accounts of overlooked roles and individuals in World War II, consider following this channel for more stories told with care and restraint.